Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.
Your vote is your voice. That's a slogan, but it really captures if you care about the schools in your community, the hospitals, the roads, any issue that involves government oversight, government regulation, government control, that affects every resident. And when you vote, you have a chance to register what to you may be priorities. Every fundamental social change we've seen in this country, in this state, in our communities, it happens at the ballot box.
That's today's guest on Optimism in Action, Bill Monning, former Senate Majority Leader of California.
SideBar is brought to you by Monterey College of Law, San Luis Obispo College of Law, Kern County College of Law, and Empire College of Law, located in Santa Rosa.
Welcome to SideBar, featuring conversations about optimism in action with lawyers and leaders inspiring change. And now your co-hosts, Jackie Gardina and Mitch Winnick.
Jackie, I am very pleased to have a colleague and a friend, Bill Monning, former Senate Majority Leader here in California, but also someone with an incredible career in public service. And we've asked Bill to come on this episode that we think of as a pre-election episode, because as an elected official, both in the state legislature as well as the state Senate, someone who has been involved in social policy and social action for his entire career, we wanted to talk about the value of voting and the impact of elections. Particularly in a couple weeks, we're going to have a November election here in California that has an important proposition. I'm thrilled to have Bill here as our guest today on SideBar.
Thank you, Jackie and Mitch. The pleasure is mine.
Let's just start with the basics. There's an opinion that obligation to vote is an idea that has somewhat waned with the American public. And we're particularly concerned about younger populations not voting. Talk about that relationship between the local citizen and the elected representative and why voting is so important in our democracy.
Your vote is your voice. That's a slogan, but it really captures if you care about the schools in your community, the hospitals, the roads, any issue that involves government oversight, government regulation, government control, that affects every resident. And when you vote, you have a chance to register what to you may be priorities. When you're voting for candidates, there may be a candidate whose views are closer to yours in terms of prioritizing education or prioritizing water resources, whatever the issue might be. So an informed voter is somebody who compares candidates and sees who is closer to my views, my beliefs, and my sense of prioritization for the role of state government, federal government, local government. But as you pose in your question, Mitch, there's many people who feel so many people vote. My vote doesn't really make a difference. There's still potholes in front of my house. I'm still struggling to make ends meet. Whatever the problems of an individual or a family might be, it's understandable why some people become cynical and think their vote doesn't make a difference. But when people don't vote, when they don't exercise that right as an eligible voter, they cede more power to those who do vote. And so the people who do vote end up dictating who their representatives will be and what will be prioritized. And maybe there is a candidate who's more likely to focus on the pothole in front of your house or getting a street light at your intersection or a crosswalk for the kids than another. Those are very close to home issues, but it goes right up to everything you care about.
Bill, I just want to distinguish between apathy at the ballot box, people who are just forgot there was even an election, versus the claims of fraud in an election, which may also lead to people choosing not to vote because why does it matter? It's fraudulent anyway. Do you think there's a big difference between those two when we hear about fraud in the election world?
I think that's an important distinction. I think apathy is people who don't care, they don't think it makes a difference, or skepticism, hearing maybe from misdirected social media, a constant refrain of fraud in elections when there's not evidence of that. Our elections are run by the states, not by the federal government. And then within the states, each county has an election department. So we have a very decentralized administration of elections, which I believe adds to the integrity. There's not a way to interfere with a ballot count statewide. It's county by county, and then it's within precincts. I think there's a third deterrent, and that's not just skepticism with the voting process, but as we talked earlier, people who feel their vote doesn't make a difference. They're dissatisfied with what they see government delivering or not delivering. And so as opposed to just being apathetic and maybe lazy, they believe strongly that their vote isn't going to make a difference. And yet every fundamental social change we've seen in this country, in this state, in our communities, it happens at the ballot box. There's so many examples of people using the ballot box to prioritize things they care about.
Let's talk about that issue that's coming up on the California ballot. I think some people are confused. They look at the national news or listen to the national news and they hear about a state such as Texas, where the state legislature, in tandem with the governor, just redrew a map on who gets to vote in which districts, and the balance of the voters within each of those map districts could influence how the likely outcome would be from a political party. California is completely different, isn't it? We don't have a legislature that can vote on their own and say, we're going to make a new map.
For many years we did, like other states. Every 10 years following the national census, that's when redistricting traditionally happens in every state. In California, for example, a census conducted in the year 2000 would inform drawing new lines in 2001 by the state legislature. For the next election, 2002, we have a set number of state Senate and state assembly seats, but it affects the number of voters in each district. Fast forward from that 2000 example to 2010, when California voters, through a statewide ballot proposition, I believe there's about 37 states in the nation that have some form of statewide ballot proposition available. Not all states do, and not all states use it on this issue. California did. So in 2010, voters did vote to establish an independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. And that commission is made up by statute of 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 members who are not in either major party. And they are selected in a process that's run by the California State Auditor, which removes politicians from most of it. They do first a broad lottery of people based on application who are interested. They can't have held an elected statewide office. And then the heads of each house do have a veto power to narrow that list, but the state auditor selects the final group of 14. That group redrew the Senate and Assembly lines. 2010 added congressional seats to that. Those were the lines we ran in 2012. Now what's on the ballot facing California voters this coming November in a couple of weeks, the question is going back to California voters. You passed this independent Citizens Commission on Redistricting, but as the governor has said, based on what you alluded to, Mitch, the decision of Texas, at the request of the President of the United States, is redrawing its lines through legislative action to try to add 5 more Republican seats in the state of Texas. The response of the governor of California, Governor Newsom, was, that's not really fair, and we need to try to maintain some level of equal representation in the House of Representatives, because their votes at the federal level affect so much of what people in every state care about. Access to health care, access to education, access to vaccines. The list goes on and on. Economic decisions, job decisions. So many of those who supported the Redistricting Commission in 2008 and again in 2010 are now saying, We think the voters who pass this should have a right, eyes wide open, looking at the current landscape, to change that decision and to temporarily suspend the independent commission, return the decision-making to the state legislature to be a player on now a playing field of 50 states. We're not acting in total isolation how we run those elections because it'll manifest at the federal level. Texas has already opted through an action of its legislature to change the lines in an effort to add 5 more Republican seats. What Newsom is saying, put this on the California ballot this coming November 4th and let the voters decide, given this new information, how redistricting is done. We in California want to give voters a choice to change our rules for 10 years until the next census and vote on this question. So that's the vote before voters. Do you want to undo what you already did once before for a temporary period of time on November 4th? And many voters already have their ballot in hand. California is increasingly a mail ballot state. There's still open ballot sites on Election Day, but every voter now receives a ballot in the mail and can return that ballot before November 4th.
And just to clarify for people who aren't California-based, California has had this independent citizen redistricting committee, which takes it out of the hands of the politicians. How many other states have opted for that kind of redistricting?
A majority of states still redistrict every 10 years by their state legislature. And we're seeing not just Texas now, but some other states, including Missouri and Tennessee, are looking at doing legislative actions to redistrict. It's not written in statute or in the U.S. Constitution. It's been the practice to redistrict every 10 years after the census, but there's nothing that requires a state to wait for those 10 years. So a state on its own volition under current law can redistrict whenever it wants. So that's what Texas did. That's what's happening in Missouri and I believe Tennessee as well. And that's what prompted the governor in California and the state legislature to say, if we sit on the sidelines and wait for the next census in 2030, we're not going to be a player at the federal level.
To connect the dots, Bill, we talked earlier about why should I vote? Why is it important to me? I think it could be easy for someone to say, gosh, Bill, this seems complicated. A commission or not a commission, the governor or citizens. What does this mean to me personally? What I hear you saying is that if an individual has a viewpoint, either party, about the way the national votes are going in Congress, this is where it happens. The distribution of who's going to get elected in California has a direct relationship to how you feel about those policies. It's not this obscure technical thing. This is about how you want to see votes made in the U.S. Congress.
That's a good summary, Mitch. And just to underscore, there's a lot of advertising on TV right now from both sides. It's Proposition 50 is the one on the ballot, November 4th. But I think a way to simplify it is, as you framed it, the decision that Californians make could have an influence on how many voices in the House of Representatives California has to potentially compete with voices from other states in making decisions on budget, on Medicare, on Social Security, on education, on climate change, on renewable energy. Every issue, fundamental issue confronting Californians and all residents of the United States today, that gets taken up by the House of Representatives. It has control over the budget, and the budget is what results in those decisions on what comes back to California. You know, California pays more taxes to the federal government than the federal government returns to the state of California. That age-old term, taxation without representation, one way to try to offset some of that disparity is by having a stronger voice in Washington, a stronger congressional delegation that can prioritize those issues for Californians.
Support for Optimism in Action comes from the Monterey College of Law, a nonprofit law school serving the Monterey Bay region with evening classes on campus or in a hybrid online format. More details and applications available at montereylaw.edu. That's montereylaw.edu.
And let's talk briefly about mail-in ballots. We just mentioned that has become a fairly standard way for people to vote. It seems to broaden the opportunity, increase the number of voters, allow those who are at work or are traveling with work or the elderly, the whole list of individuals who may or may not be able to take the time and have the resources to get to a polling place for a specific number of hours on a specific day. Yet, we've been hearing this discussion about mail-in ballots being the basis of fraud. There seems to be no actual evidence of that. You were an elected representative here in California. Can you give us any insight on what you've seen?
So in the state of California, there's no evidence of any voter fraud related to mail ballots. There have been no prosecutions that I'm aware of. It's a very well-regulated system. There are checks and balances. There's an actual authentication of each voter's signature on the mail-in ballot. And election officials have the authority to check any ballot that they suspect has been fraudulently procured. But there is a constant drumbeat in the country right now, and again, a lot of it propelled through social media, suggesting that there's massive fraud with mail-in ballots. And it's interesting, at the risk of sounding partisan, it has been traditionally Republicans who were the biggest champions of mail ballots, particularly for shut-in seniors, for people for whom getting to the ballot box was not easy. It used to be to get a absentee ballot, as it was called, you had to have some proof of illness, disability, inability to get to the poll on election day. That progressed to where several states, and including California, now have an all-mail ballot that every voter receives a ballot. In addition, the California legislature has passed budget allocations that your return ballot envelope has postage prepaid, so you don't have to hunt for a stamp. And as a candidate who used to knock on doors and try to encourage people to send in their absentee ballot, the response we often heard is, well, it's ready to go, but I don't have any stamps. So we removed that problem. It's not a civic obligation, but I do think it's a civic responsibility to exercise the right to vote. And by making it as easy to vote and get your ballot back to be counted, I think that facilitates civic engagement and social responsibility. I will point out there are some countries, including Australia, where voting is mandatory. And if you don't vote, you're subject to civil penalties. Some countries think it is so important, such a social imperative, that they have passed laws mandating every eligible voter cast a ballot. That's not the case in this country. It's not the case in this state. It's a totally voluntary act. Contrary to common sense, the more local you get in elections, there's a lower voter turnout than there is for a national presidential one. I attribute that some to just the massive media coverage of national presidential campaigns.
Bill, I just want to flip from the voter to who the voter is voting for. How can we incentivize people, especially younger people, to run for office given the current environment?
It's a great question, and it gets back to our earlier conversation about apathy versus skepticism. And many young people just choose to avoid anything that's political. They have kind of an aversion. And there's a saying, not just held by young people, but maybe especially by young people, they almost wear as a badge of honor. They say, well, I'm not political. I'm not into politics. And the way I respond to that, I've heard that knocking at people's front doors who don't want to talk to a candidate. And they say, well, thanks, but I'm not into politics. And then my response is, well, do you care about your water quality? Do you care if there's an ambulance service to get your child to an emergency room if there's an accident? everything in our day-to-day life is political. And the question becomes, who is determining, again, the prioritization of policies, of spending? And if you as an apolitical person care about anything, care about music being taught in the schools, care about the safety of your water, the ability of a fire department to respond in less than 5 minutes, then you care about things. You're just not translating it to how your participation as a voter. And voting is kind of the easiest part of political participation. Voting is voluntary, but it takes maybe 15 minutes, maybe a half an hour on a complicated ballot to exercise your voice, pop it in the mail, and you can move on with whatever else you want to do.
And I think voting is an act of optimism. I think running for office is an act of optimism. It's saying, I believe that my voice will be heard, or it's important that I put my thoughts out there. When we see this apathy or apolitical or distrust of the system, how do you talk to people about being optimistic that their voice is heard and being optimistic that they can be part of the change?
I like that formulation, but I don't know that you need to be optimistic to embrace some level of social responsibility or voter responsibility. In fact, it may be your pessimism that is the greatest incentive. But I think in organizing, when you're the candidate knocking on doors, what I always found most useful, a lot of people, when they step up and step into the public arena, you are crossing a line where you're sacrificing privacy, not just for yourself, but your family. There are sacrifices, but you're motivated because you want to make a difference. You are motivated by optimism. Think, I can make a difference if I have an opportunity to be in this position. But part of your job is to listen to the people that you're seeking to vote for you to represent them. I always started by asking questions. What are issues that are most important to you? I always felt the voter should lead the conversation to educate you. What are the issues important to them? And then react honestly if you have thoughts on that or a platform issue. To me, the greatest part of being a candidate or participating in electoral politics, the electoral arena, is that exchange between candidate or elected official and voter. Our challenge right now, I believe, is keeping it at a level of civic engagement and respectful engagement. And we have, unfortunately, far too many examples right now nationally and in our state where the process has been denigrated and degraded to not just sharp words, but sharp actions and people not feeling safe.
So as a final question, Bill, I suspect I know what your answer is, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Jackie asks about optimism, and we're talking about optimism in action as our theme this season. The American democracy, and they always talk about it as the great experiment in democracy as a republic. Many people are not optimistic. What are your thoughts?
It's a fundamental question of our time, I believe, and I don't think there's any absolutes. People think we live in a country with a hard-fought constitution. It's undergone changes with time, with amendments. We have kind of a set of rules, a set of engagement and respect for fundamental personal liberties, freedom. And a lot of people see that being threatened right now. There's no guarantees. To protect a vibrant republic, a vibrant democratic process, requires constant vigilance and constant engagement. So if people are fearful of what they see happening, then to me that should trigger the call now more than ever. People need to not just vote, but to become involved in civic organizations. I believe nothing is guaranteed about our freedoms and about protecting our constitutional rights, and we need to sound the alarm if we think they're being threatened and do everything we can to protect them. But I believe constructive, respectful engagement and dialogue is what's a cornerstone of a healthy democracy, and we need to continue to make clear that that's our priority.
Thank you, Bill. That's great. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mitch and Jackie, so much. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I want to congratulate you on the news of being now affiliated with local NPR station KAZU. Bravo.
Jackie, that was great to hear from Bill Monning, who's spent decades of his career as a public servant, both elected and in many other nonprofit policy and education roles. The message I took away from that was a reminder that if we want to be engaged in what happens in our country, and as Bill kept reminding us, and our neighborhood, one of the key elements of that is voting. Even in elections like the one that's coming up here in California, that's a fairly low profile without any major candidates, without any big campaigns going on, and with the major item, a proposition related to drawing voter maps. A lot of people could say, it's just not important.
I was serious when I said I think voting is an act of optimism, because it is the voter saying, this is what I believe, this is what I want, and I'm going to put it out there. When you look at our voting percentages, they are incredibly low. In fact, more people failed to vote in the 2024 election than actually voted for either of the candidates. You need to get out and actually vote in order to be able to say yes or no to the policies that are being implemented at the national, at the state, at the local level. Please take voting seriously. Be optimistic and get out there and vote.
That is part of the fundamental decision-making that we're each granted in our democracy, to have our opinions represented locally, statewide, and nationally.
Once again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today on Sidebar. And as always, Mitch and I would love to know what's on your mind. You can reach us at sidebarmedia.org.
Sidebar would not be possible without our producer, David Eakin, who composes and plays all of the music you hear on Sidebar. Thank you also to Dina Dowsett, who creates and coordinates Sidebar's social media marketing.
Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.